Eyes are what draws the viewer in most character illustrations. When something about them is off, the viewer is most likely to notice it there. It also comes from human nature. When you look at someone, you most likely look them in the eyes. Hi, here's May, and today I'll talk about drawing eyes. I will start from realistic eyes and then apply the most relevant things to stylized eyes, how you can draw eyes in perspective and what you can do to make your eye drawings unique, since it's often what stands out about each artist and there are so many ways of drawing them. For example, when you look at anime, you'll find that the eyes or the hairstyles are what is most unique about each character, while the face shapes or how the noses or mouth are portrayed tend to be the same in one style or universe. And the hairstyles, of course, but also the eye shapes are often varied. I already made a basic head or face tutorial video, and there I described where on the face I would place the eyes. I also talked a bit about stylizing eyes differently in the drawing different anime faces videos. If you're interested in any of that, you can also check that out after watching this video. Even if you want to draw stylized eyes, it's good to have a basic understanding of them, because you can later on use that knowledge for drawing stylized eyes as well. First, the eyes are placed in the skull and the eye socket. You don't have to know the whole skull anatomy, but in general, the eyes are inside in the face, and from the side you can see how they are protruding from the face. Keep in mind that the eyes are a 3D shape, and you can use planes to separate different eye parts to help you visualize that they are in 3D. I visualized this by drawing the eye from above, and you could use a inner, front, and outer plane here. For the general eye shape, usually you would go for 3 lines for the upper eyelash and 2 lines on the lower. But I also made a version here with 3 lines on the lower side, which you can do if you want to. The iris is a bit smaller than half of the length of the whole eye, and when you are changing perspective, it's really helpful to visualize the 3 planes I mentioned before and have them change in perspective. And like this, for example, the inner plane could get smaller while the outer plane gets bigger when the eye is turned and so on. If you're drawing upwards looking eyes, make sure that the eye shape is curved upwards and the distance of the eyebrow and eye increases here. While for a downwards looking eye, the eye shape will be curved downwards and the distance of the eyebrow and the eye decreases. This is also applicable to when you draw stylized eyes, which I'll move on to next. Then for stylized eyes, you would use the same 3 planes or planes for the upper eyelash and for the lower one 2 or 3, and here you can then change up the angle, sizes and proportions. You could also simplify it even more and just use 1 line for both the upper and lower end and so on. What you can consider when you are making decisions about changing the eye shape is the personality of the character and whose eyes are you drawing, and if you're drawing fan art of an existing character, then you will already have a eye shape you can draw from, but you don't necessarily have to copy it. You can of course also change it up a bit to have it fit more into the way you want to draw the character. You could also be inspired by general simplified shapes. Do you want the eye to be more like a circle, a triangle, and do you want it to be wider or taller, and how wide should the eye be open? And for the lashes, if you want a more aggressive or dominant look, you could have the outer end be more upwards, while for a more soft and innocent face, the outer end of the upper lash would be more downwards. Then you can ask yourself if the eye should have more of a blocky or rounded outline in general. There's also this line above the upper lash, which represents the eyelid, and changing up this line can also affect how the eye look. You can also add additional wrinkles if you want to. Finally, you can also change the size of the iris and even the shape. If you want a more friendly and young character, the iris will often be bigger and rounder, while for older or aggressive characters, the iris will be smaller and thinner. And here I also wrote down what I just talked about in more of a checklist way. So when you're coming up with an eye shape, you could go through each one of these aspects and play around with it to, in the end, come up with a lot of different eyes. And I also added the highlights in here for most eyes, unless you want the character to look a bit dead inside maybe. You would add highlights, and here you can of course also change the amount, the placement, and you could even change the highlight shape. All of the things I've talked about up until now really focused on the drawing aspect and outlining and so on. But for eyes, the shading is often what makes it even more unique and stand out. So here you can change how simple or detailed this is. Also the colors, of course. If you want there to be a color variation in the eye color or just one color. And most of the time for the eye shading you would have the upper part be dark and shaded, kind of where the eyelash would form a shadow, and then the lower part would be brighter. And there are many ways of drawing details and different small lines into the iris. And if you want to go for a more cartoony look, you could, for example, also just go with 2 colors and have a black shadow, which intersects with the pupil. For the stylization options, I also added the pupil, something you can customize, of course. You could also have the ends of the eye blend in with the face a bit more if you want to go for a softer look, for example. And I will now move on to tips and guidelines to keep in mind for drawing good looking eyes. And I mostly draw anime eyes, so this will probably focus more on these types of eyes. When you're drawing eyes in perspective, it's good to start off with the whole head in perspective and use a guideline for the curvature of the head for placing them, but for more details, to make sure the whole eye shape is in perspective, for example, it makes sense to first sketch in the general shape before adding details like the lashes. You can also check again if the iris placement and how curved the eyelash is, for example, for both eyes by drawing additional mini guidelines. I got this tip from a video by the Cecile for drawing anime eyes, which I found very helpful, and she also mentioned drawing in the whole iris even if it's partly covered, which can help a lot too. I don't do this most of the time though. This also depends on what iris shape you're going for. And I also have some guidelines for drawing eyes in perspective. And finally, I will mention some tips or mistakes I made while drawing eyes and what I learned from these mistakes. First is to draw both eyes together. I don't mean literally at the same time with 2 pens or something like that, but after you've done one step for one eye, like doing the whole shape or even just the upper eyelash, you would do it on the other side before you move on to drawing the iris or so on. So this is very helpful because you can then train your mind to draw a shape and then try to translate the shape mirrored on the other side in the perspective, and the more often you do this, the better you will get at it. Then something I especially struggled with was using flat lines for the eye outlines. You can do this for very stylized eyes, but it tends to make the faces look more flat. As a third mistake, I have drawing a too big pupil and iris as well. This again can be a stylistic choice, but often when you make these too big, there will be a lack of expression for the character and it can look a bit creepy. Next, about the 3/4 view, a mistake I often used to make was to not draw in the second eye completely. It will always be visible. I also mentioned this in my head tutorial video. And also the overall eye shape will of course change. The more you turn the face for the 3/4 view, the second eye gets less wide, and the pupil sometimes is also not in the center of the iris anymore when you want to, for example, draw the character looking at the viewer. And next, it's very important to make sure the pupils or the eyes look like they look in the same direction, and for this you can focus on only placing the pupils first before drawing the irises and mirroring your canvas a bunch of times to make sure they look in the same direction. And even when you're drawing traditionally, you can take a picture and mirror this picture to make sure the eyes are looking at around the same direction. And for drawing the eye shape, mirroring the canvas to make sure one eye is not bigger than the other is something that has helped me a lot. The next mistake I'm going to mention is to forget the upper lash line. For some styles this may work, but most eyes will have this upper lash line and it can be placed very differently. And the next mistake I mentioned is to completely outline the eye. I mentioned that you could play around with how you want to outline the eye, but here I mean that you also outline the inner end where the kind of tear duct would be in the realistic eye. The next mistake I mentioned is to add too many highlights or lashes. Having too many lashes can make the eyes look hairy. Too many highlights can lead to confusing looking eyes. The final mistake I mentioned is to not have the eyelashes following the directions of the veins around the eyes, and also not having different line weight for the lashes, which can look like spider legs. That's it for this eye tutorial video. I hope your characters can now look amazing and look amazingly. I hope you now have some things to play around with when adding eyes to your character. I will also have a small time lapse of me figuring out some eye shading for a project I was working on here, because for this you can really play around a lot and often you will find that for no artists it's exactly the same. Thanks for watching, have a nice day and goodbye.